Welcome to the Art of Living Free series with Anthony Szilard, brought to you by theartoflivingfree.org. Today we explore Experiencing Trauma, Part 1.
Okay, so for today's session, we're going to take a look at how many of us are experiencing trauma during this pandemic. This pandemic for many people is kind of a collective traumatization. Like many people are feeling a sense of threat. And when we think about trauma, trauma is really like any life-threatening situation. So it could be crime, violence, rape, poverty, illness, natural disaster. Whenever we feel that our lives are threatened, we experience a sense of trauma. Well, of course, today, with this pandemic going on now, in 4 months now, I think many people are experiencing that, and it has certain effects. So I've interviewed, probably about 400 or 500 people on how they experience trauma. I've done interviews with 10 police departments across the country, across the United States, in Kansas, Georgia, and California. Also, I've done interviews with nonprofit staff, counselors, and others serving disadvantaged populations. And there's another concept that you may want to know about, which is called secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is when an individual has an extended interaction or protracted interaction with a second person who is experiencing primary trauma. Primary trauma, again, it's any life-threatening situation. So that second person, through that protracted interaction, they can receive some of the trauma. It's through what's called emotion contagion. So essentially the emotions pass to them. Think like secondhand smoke. It's kind of like that. You're in the vicinity long enough and you're sort of putting your mind into the stories of the person experiencing the primary trauma, you can receive some of it. So we're going to take a look at how primary and secondary trauma, how we can deal with them in the face of this pandemic. So one thing that's important when you're thinking about trauma is that it's essentially a source of pain or suffering. And pain or suffering can lead to two things. For most people, pain or suffering becomes anger directed towards the source of that suffering. Some of us see that source as external to us, so we can be angry at politicians, we can be angry at other people for whether they're wearing masks or not, or whether they're gathering, or how they're managing the pandemic. We can be angry at ourselves, we can internalize it and think like there's something wrong with me and that's why I'm experiencing this. So I like to think that pain and anger are flip sides of the same coin. Essentially, we feel pain, and then we say, okay, who's the source of this pain? And we think, okay, that's this person who made this comment to me. They said that I'm ugly, or they don't like my haircut, or they said that I should have answered that question in a better way. And so we feel pain, and what we do then is we flip the coin, and it becomes anger. And we look at who is the source of that, and we identify the other person, and then we express anger toward them. And we say, well, maybe if you phrased the question better, I would have understood you. And then the other person comes back. They now receive the pain. They flip it into anger and then say, who is the source of their pain? It must be us. And they come back with, well, if you had half a brain, maybe you would do this. And we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So basically, I'm describing I'm describing like warfare, violence, most marriages, right? That like one argument that goes on for a lifetime. Like you did this, you did that. It's going back and forth, trading pain and anger. And what some people do is they instead take their pain and they transform it into passion. So they actually take this trauma or this pain and they say, okay, so how, like, I don't want to experience this pain anymore. And you know what? I'm gonna extend beyond myself. And think I don't want others to experience pain like this either. We think about some of our greatest leaders that have ever graced this planet. Think about like Gandhi being thrown off a train in South Africa when he was a lawyer there, and then sort of rallying millions of Indians to sort of speak out for their rights vis-a-vis the British. Or think about Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. Think about the suffering, the pain they experienced, discrimination, racism in their families and their communities, and then they each in their own way started rallying people to rise up against that oppression. with Martin Luther King Jr. looking at it as racism as a civil rights issue, trying to take that issue to the United States government, versus Malcolm X seeing it as a human rights issue, taking it to the United Nations, forming his Organization of African American Unity before he was assassinated. In all of these cases, you have individuals who experience pain or suffering and they transform it into passion. So I'll give you another example. A woman I coached for many years. She was a marketing director in a Fortune 100 pharmaceutical company, and she came to me once and she said, "Tony, I really don't like my job. I don't know what to do. I'm making tons of money, but I don't enjoy it. What should I do here?" And so we sat down, we started talking, and I take a psychoanalytic approach and started asking her about how she grew up and what she'd experienced. And it turns out most of her childhood, she and her mother, until she was 12 years old, nurtured her father who was dying of cancer until he passed. And so we talked about this, and she started thinking more about like what really drives her, what are her true motivations, and see if you can guess what she does now. So many people with a gender bias say, well, maybe she's a nurse. But she's not a nurse. She's a director of a major hospital, leading a team of doctors and medical researchers to find cures to cancer and other diseases so fewer families will suffer the way hers has. So again, it's taking that pain and transforming it into passion. So let's come back to the trauma many of us are experiencing during this pandemic. So there is a concept which is developed by Lawrence Calhoun and Richard Tedeschi, two psychologists at the University of North Carolina, and they invented this term 25 years ago. It's called post-traumatic growth, and it's this idea that you can actually grow from trauma, like from what you experience, from adversity. You can actually find something in there that affects you, that changes your life philosophy, your worldview, your relationship with yourself, your relationships with others. And this is precisely what is happening for many of us during this pandemic, is we're basically saying, you know what, I don't want to go back to the pre-pandemic me. Like, I don't want to be that person anymore. I know so many people that I've been in conversations with, sharing how this is happening to them. I think about it myself. I think like now, every day I take an hour and a half in the morning to play with my kids, take them to the park, an hour in the afternoon to play with them. I stop working earlier, so I have to get up really early so I can still get my 8 hours of work in. But I feel like I'm becoming a better father. I still have a long way to go, but I'm learning more about that. I'm also, we're thinking about a lot of things, about the sort of ecological footprint that we have. About there's so many ways. And even just valuing relationships, just valuing being able to sit and have a social distance lunch with someone, and I think that's part of what's happening for many, is that while many people are seeing the pandemic as a kind of giant monster, some are seeing it as a giant reset button and saying, I'm going to take this time to really make change in my life. So the interesting thing is that you can ask yourself, how are you thinking during this pandemic? Are you engaged in rumination? Like rumination meaning, are you like thinking the same negative thoughts over and over and over and over again, which leads a lot of people toward depression? Or are you engaged in ideation? Are you thinking like, okay, you know what? I have a lot to think about with what's going on, but I'm going to exercise, I'm going to go for a walk, I'm going to get to do things that help me to feel more whole and content with myself, and then I'm going to think, okay, and start to create ideas. How do you want your life to be different? I think about one guy who I coached, who used to be a bus driver in Washington, D.C. And he was driving, and there was a gang fight on his bus, and he was shot twice. And he said to me, he said, that changed my life. Like having that experience, having that bullet ripped through my body, those two bullets ripped through my body, and just realizing, like before that, I was so caught up in how I looked, so caught up in money and material things. And afterwards I was like, you know what, I'm just grateful to be walking on this beautiful green earth. Like I'm grateful for the relationships I have in my life, for the people who I love, and just really treasuring those relationships really changed. And this is post-traumatic growth. This is what happens when we experience trauma and then we make a change and we say, I don't look at the world the same anymore. My core values, my core beliefs are shifting. And I'll tell you, because I've done like 400 or 500 interviews with police and nonprofit folks who have experienced a tremendous amount of trauma. And what happens in these interviews is that first they share about the trauma they've experienced, how it's led to stress and burnout, and often drug use, spousal abuse, you name it, like just all kinds of dysfunctional kind of behaviors. And then in the middle of the interview, I'll say, so I want to ask you, how has this trauma you've experienced benefited you? And it kind of stops them, like, Say, well, what do you mean? Well, think about the person you were before you experienced this trauma, and think about the person you are now. How have your values evolved? How have they been refined because of what you experienced? Carl Rogers talks about becoming as a human being. So, I don't go into that in the interview because I might lose people. But basically, how do we become more like our higher selves, the person that we desire ourselves to be?
Life offers us many challenges, and theartoflivingfree.org offers new ways of thinking so we can see these challenges from a new angle and overcome them. Whether it's Anthony Szilard's free blog, video or podcast series, his book, Screened In: The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, or personalized courses, theartoflivingfree.org will help you refine your life vision and then transform it into action. Find out more at theartoflivingfree.org.